Perfect. So thank you everyone who joined us today. It's our second episode in our Future of Work webinar series. And today our guest speaker is Dr. Kelly Monahan, who is the Managing Director of Upwork Research Institute and the co-author of the national bestseller Essential: How Distributed Teams, Generative AI, and Global Shifts Are Creating a New Human-Powered Leadership. So Kelly, thank you so much for joining us today. And the
Yes,
floor is yours.
thank you so much for having me. And thank you for all who are joining today. I love what Wikistrat's doing here by really, combining an exclusive opportunity to come together to have deeper conversation and ultimately community, I think, around some of the most pressing issues facing leaders today. So we're going to jump right off the bat, and I actually want us to get some audience participation going. So we can use the chat that you see. But before we get started, and I share with you some of the findings we uncovered through our research with Wikistrat, I want to ask this question because I've been a future of work researcher now for over a dozen years, and I came across this transcript that had taken place at an industry meeting. And it was this urgent call that this industry meeting was put together because of these 5 top issues that were facing executives. So my question is, and join me in the chat as I voice over this, what year do you think this conference was held? Number one concern that was raised was the lack of skilled workers, which impedes production and really productivity. And so that was a big issue of how do we make sure that we've got the right skilled labor from a market perspective to ensure that we can maintain operations. Second thing, we're struggling to recruit the next generation of workers. One of the actual quotes from the transcript was, "It was so hard to capture the hearts and minds of the upcoming generation. Do they even want to work anymore?" was the question that was asked. Number 3, technology is overwhelming people, their workforce. Technology was accelerating. One of the direct quotes there was, technology was accelerating faster than the workforce ability to keep up. Fourth thing, and I think anyone who's in the HR space can relate to this, that there was just an inefficient amount of resources and dedication towards skills development. And then finally, number 5, which I think that many of us feel today, is technically we've got a lot of people in management that are technically skilled, but lack when it comes to the people influence management. So I'm curious, those of you who are joining us today live, what year do you think this list was compiled? And please feel free to use your chat to answer here. See if we get some engagement. We see 2024 coming in. Yes, that is probably one of the most popular guesses whenever I do this presentation. Got a 1990, 2000. Thank you for those participating. I'm going to take one more guess to see. We've got in the last 25 years or so. See coming in 2015. Thank you, Monica, for that. So, the reality is this list and this transcript was compiled in 1955. So I saw we get another 2005 guess. So the reality is this was compiled 50 years ago. And to me, and the reason why we engage with Wikistrat is when I came across this historical research, I wanted to understand, why does this resemble our workplaces today? Why does this resemble the exact same concerns that we have today? Why have we not figured this out? And so we engaged on this project with Wikistrat. It was in May 2023. So, we were reflecting, it was, right as ChatGPT was entering the stage. I work at Upwork. We continue to see the rise of freelancers, both from a small business perspective, but also larger business, really begin to think through their talent model and mix differently to be much more agile. We engaged with 21 experts, and we did the 3-phased approach with Wikistrat, where we did scenario development. We then did collaboration and collective peer reviews over those scenarios. And then finally, I had the opportunity to engage in in-depth interviews to really explore some of those macro themes in more detail. 21 experts. We did a cross-industry and cross. So it was certainly filled with technologists, people who are expert in remote work and leadership. But we also had professors, anthropologists, people who just view the world a bit differently than the traditional business sense. And there were 3 things that were raised, and I'm going to double click on these over the next several minutes. And I invite you, if you have a question, I want this to be interactive. So please feel free. We're going to save some time at the end, but by all means, feel free to ask your question and interact throughout. So 3 things that we discovered that were really important. 1, the velocity of business decision-making and execution were faster than what we think has ever occurred before. and the pressure that executives are under to make decisions faster and move with speed really was becoming this top issue that was emerging in the research. Sure, there's been change management for a very long time, but the reality is in the context and the speed in which change is occurring is faster than ever before. The second thing is productivity. This is again in 2023, which I think this was so profound how true this ended up being where we live today. Is this hyper focus and productivity was going to occur because of the advancements in AI, and that executives' gut reactions were going to be to use this to help meet the increased velocity of decision making and really use this as an efficiency play. And then number three, there was this huge sound of alarm that there could be massive job displacement if we didn't get ahead of this and really focus on reskilling and upskilling. And so that is what I've focused on for the last, couple years, and took those trends and wanted to continue to map out as a researcher what we were beginning to take place in this. And the reality is, after doing this research, someone had quoted this research from E&Y, and I think this is actually quite profound as well, because the reality is we have more technology at our fingertips. We have more access to globalized talent models and really the best of talent within organizations. And yet, this is obviously a US stat, but companies are spending much less time on the S&P 500 than ever before. So back in the 1940s, the average lifespan of a company in the S&P 500 was 67 years. Today, that's down to 15 years. And this is a massive problem because we have, like I said, the technology and talent accessible, but the way in which we're operating and the way in which we're leading our organizations, I think it is actually not working for the majority of organizations today. And yes, some of this is, can be attributed to mergers and acquisitions, which is decreasing the lifespan. But the reality is the social contract between a person and their employer has continued to shorten, not grow longer, the smarter we get with our technologies. And so there's this book I highly recommend, and it's not essential. Obviously, I'm going to recommend that as well, but by the same author who wrote Black Swan. So he came up with a second book called Anti-Fragile: Things That Gain from Disorder. And this is the key question I want us to think about and consider, which is, we're going to see in this next slide, is I think what the research is pointing to, because of the velocity of business decision making, because of remote work, because of globalized talent, because of AI, the way that we currently do work today is fragile and it's breaking. I think it's breaking across many institutions. We see that even at a government level here in the United States. But our existing way of thinking about systems is becoming very fragile in light of all the stressors. And the gut reaction, I think, where a lot of the conversation is going to is, well, how do you then become a resilient organization? You take the exact same system that you have today and make sure that it's able to withstand change. That's good, but I actually am going to argue that it's not good enough. And what we actually need is to become anti-fragile, meaning we actually have to change the foundations and the assumptions and the way that we actually think about organizing work to become something new today in order to withstand the macro stressors that we're going to talk about over the next several minutes. And so, as the author says here, not seeing a tsunami or an economic event is excusable, but building something fragile that's not able to withstand them is not. And so, I think the question is, do you feel like the organization that you're leading today, the team that you're leading today, what bucket does this fall in? Do you feel that it's actually ready to meet the demands of this new way of working? Or do you think it's actually fragile? And so that's, I think, something that we have to continue to discuss today is what new systems of work must emerge to withstand the pressures challenging outdated work practices. So I want you to be thinking about this throughout this presentation and our time together. And really, if you have ideas, I am here to listen. I think this is a really big conversation. I don't think this is going to be something that we can solve over the next 45 minutes together. But I do think collectively coming together as a community of experts to, one, acknowledge that our current practices are outdated and no longer working is part one. And then part two is, well, what is that new system? What is that new way of leading that has to occur in such a time as this in order to actually become anti-fragile and making sure that we've got organizations and workforces that are not just surviving, but actually thriving in the amount of chaos and uncertainty that continues to come before us. So I am all ears. Please feel free to add in the chat any ideas you have or any other ways that you've seen successful of new ways of operating. So To get started, what we're going to do just to orient you with our time today is I'm going to go through the 5 macro trends that we identified with Wikistrat with updated research stats to orient you with the stressors. The second thing that we're then going to do is talk about the new leadership model that I'm, saying it has to occur in order to meet these demands. And then we're going to say 15, 20 minutes at the end for Q&A. But as I mentioned, feel free to have questions come throughout hand. I want this to be interactive. So I told you with Wikistrat, we predicted in 2023 that AI development was accelerating. Of course, that was happening. But I think what's become really nuanced and unique that we as a group of experts and community leaders need to think about is this is accelerating during a time of really, from a global perspective, an uncertain economic environment. And so, what that means and what we see every day happening in the headlines is that workforce development is lacking because the investment is going into AI and the technology side. We see this with all the tech companies that are, either doing layoffs to put more money back in AI R&D, and it's almost becoming at the expense of people. And so this is research that, because of the Wikistrat research, Upwork conducted to really begin to unpack this more. And what we found is that only 40% of executives even know what the AI skills are within their organization. They even have an awareness of who within their organization is working on AI and who is not. That means the majority of executives today are flying, quite frankly, blind when it comes to AI development in their organization. Only 1 in 4 leaders today actually have a workforce training program in place. And as a result of this, what's happening is that the majority of leaders today are saying their productivity has stalled because of lack of AI investment and development alongside the workforce. And, if we look at the most latest Edelman Trust research, we found that, 58% of the global workers actually carry a lot of strong fear today of being displaced because of AI. So that's the first thing, is I think, yes, AI is going to continue to accelerate, and there's great technologists that can talk about the technology. But I think what we need to focus on from a work system and leadership perspective is how do we catch up people and make sure that there's enough emphasis on the skilling and training that needs to take place. The second big trend that we talked a lot about in the Wikistrat research that continues to take place today is really around Gen Z and how a new generation of workers is demanding to work different. Now, this stat may alarm you, may not. I'll be curious to get some reactions going in the chat right away. But what recent research found is that 47% of Gen Zers find that AI provides better career coaching than their bosses. And so I think what's, something to be paying attention to today is Gen Z right off the bat is feeling very comfortable going to AI for leadership, going to AI for, tasks and roles that were essentially human before in terms of middle management and leaders. And instead, they don't find that the human leadership is happening enough within their organizations. And 1 and 2 are actually turning to some version of a chat GPT, Claude, Meta's Llama to actually help fill that gap. And again, I think this is what we can talk about today. Is this the right decision? Is this something that we want to offload to AI? Or should coaching and leadership be a uniquely human skill? So, just some quick stats here, and we'll make sure that everyone has access to the research and slides afterwards for coming today. But the reality is, because of this, what you see is almost this angst occurring within the younger generation as they think about the workplace. Less than half actually think that business is having a positive impact on society. And so Gen Z is coming to the workplace right off the bat thinking, I'm not sure business is causing good. I'm not sure this organization is going to be on the right side of history. And so there's already coming in with a sense of mistrust and skepticism around the way that many organizations are operating and being led today. Their top concerns, which we're going to talk about in a second, why this is the case: cost of living and unemployment. Things have gotten much more expensive. And I think the other thing is, as a byproduct of this, what we're seeing is, less than half of Gen Zers see work as a critical part of their identity. They are not looking to identify as strongly with work in their organization as millennials were at the same time in their life cycle. And then the reality is, if you were to ask me today as a researcher, who do you think is actually struggling to perform in our organizations today? Gen Z. And what they tell us is, when I go deeper in the research, is it's because of the outdated, antiquated system that they're working in. It's causing so much friction in who they are, how they want to perform, and how they want to experience their work. It's a complete mismatch. And as a result, we're seeing really stalled levels of productivity and engagement within the workforce that should be, and arguably some of the most excited to get started. And so I'd be curious to see, um, for those of you who are joining us today, are you seeing this within your workforce? Are you seeing this phenomenon of Gen Z in particular play out? And how are you addressing that? And then, kind of something that I've been studying is what I'm calling the Gen Z paradox, because it's like, well, where is this coming from? Why is Gen Z struggling so much? And I think it really has a lot to do with expectations and reality. And so if you take a look, this illustration was by Tim Urban, who I just think has done a brilliant job capturing this through a visual. If baby boomers who may be joining us on the call today, it was a gradual, slow progress. You had much longer runways within your existing organization. There was a much stronger social contract in place. And as a result, there was a quite linear career path that you took over time. And oftentimes, that expectation gap between what you expected work to be and the reality wasn't that far apart in terms of timing of when you met success. But now we take a big step back and we think about Gen Zs coming into the workforce because of that velocity that we just talked about, decisions being made faster, business moving faster. They're expecting as an individual to keep pace with that same rate of change. And so even what I see oftentimes managing a younger workforce is this, coming from a consulting industry, used to say up or out every 2 years. Either you kept growing and progressing every 2 years or you left the organization. There really wasn't an in between. And I think this is being played out at a large scale as we think about Gen Z today of what's next and what's happening. There's a big expectation gap that it's going to take much longer to get to the income levels, the career promotion paths, and the sense of putting in your time is in direct opposition to the way that technology and the way that they're being wired as customers. The workforce experience has a big gap. And so that's, from a Gen Z perspective, what we're seeing. Now, what we identified with Wikistrat, with our group of experts, is on the other side of the spectrum of the 100-year life and the 100-year career and how that's influencing work itself today. And again, I'm not going to necessarily go through and read you all this in the slide, but the reality is most organizations are not ready to continue to, have work for people who are going to start living 85, 95, 100 plus years in the near future. And so what happens as our workforce continues to age and stays in place longer within the workforce? I told you that Gen Z paradox, they're already expecting more and less time. And that time might even become longer as the aging workforce stays in leadership and positions of power longer. And so this dynamic is going to be something to continue to think through as a leader. How do you balance this? And how do you make sure that we're not ignoring either end of the spectrum? And it's not to ignore Gen X or millennials in between, but these two ends of the spectrum of where we're seeing some extreme trends that we haven't necessarily seen before in our lifetime. And so that leads us to, the fourth trend here, which is the eroding purchasing power, which is necessitating, and we saw this, we're calling it portfolio of work, side jobs, side gigs. We see this a lot at Upwork, where you have full-time workers coming. Software engineers, as an example, is one of our faster growing categories, come onto a platform like Upwork to continue to maintain their cost of living. Why is this phenomenon happening? I mean, for those in the States, the Bureau of Labor Statistics just reported that there's more people holding multiple jobs than there ever have been before. These stats are pretty alarming. And this is something we talked a lot about with Wikistrat experts, which is, as we look at the cost of living and the inequality here that's underneath some of this, one, price of a house has gone up 1,700% and higher. Price of education is over 1,800%. This is a true barrier of entry to many people across the globe today when it comes to finding professions that are more stable and, as they begin to work alongside technology. Overall, just from an inflation perspective, I mean, that's certainly been in the headlines here for the last couple of years. But overall, we have seen, the cost of goods and services go up 567%. Here's the reality, though, and I think this is where the rubber meets the road and the uncomfortable conversation we have to have today as leaders, is we look at wage increases to keep up with this. What we see is CEO and executive level pay has gone up 1,300% to keep pace. So the standard of living is able to be maintained. When it comes to the average worker increase over the same time period, it is only 18%. And so this area of inequity and inequality is going to continue to become a very big issue in the future of work that we must solve for. This goes all the way back to Henry Ford's days in the 1920s when they were producing cars, and yet his workforce was not paid enough to actually own them and become customers of them. I think we're going to be in the same phenomenon today. We're going to have this great technology, but whether or not people are going to be able to afford it is going to be another thing. And so, what this means is, as a leadership perspective, and this research always fascinates me, is we have to rethink the very framing of talent acquisition and the way that we think about talent. We are still so wired in business today to think about the full-time employee model and a one-to-one relationship. I talk to executives all the time, and the thought of an employee working for another company or having the side job apply their expertise in another area really aggravates them. But the reality is, and we talked a lot about this during the simulation, is we have to move from a talent acquisition, a one-to-one relationship with talent today, to a talent access, where we are accessing talent on demand as necessary. And it's okay if they go and work somewhere else or go apply that talent elsewhere. And if you look at the stat, it's shocking to me. When we ask, leaders, do you want to work with the best talent? Whether it's full-time, whether that's freelancer, does the type of, worker matter? If you take a look at the research, 92% of high performing companies say, yes, I don't care what the work arrangement is. I want to work with the highest performing talent. However, the rest of their peers who are not experiencing the same level of performance, only 69% answered yes to that question, which means there's a very strong bias to moving to this way of working that I'd love to continue to unpack with this group today. And so finally, what does this all lead to? Where are we actually seeing the state of the workforce today? This is alarming, and I've been obviously following the Edelman Gallup research for, a long time now, and we continue to see the trend go in the wrong direction. And that is that, global workers believe that businesses are purposely misguiding people. Only 30% of US leaders today actually think they're leaving a workforce in a better position. And it's resulting in 1 in 3 employees say are saying they're gonna quit because of this dynamic. And so the question I just want us to pause before we move to leadership for the next 10 or 15 minutes, then open it up for Q&A, is what is 1 or 2 words that you would like to be described as you think about leaving your legacy? And please feel free, if you're comfortable, sharing in the chat what those 1 or 2 words might be. But as you reflect on your own leadership, we are in a, really historic time. Some are calling it a historic time of crisis, but we are certainly in a time where the current system and institutions are no longer serving the majority of leaders and workers today. And so what's the legacy you want to leave in this moment? And the one thing I'll say is, every time I ask this question, I never see words like, I want to be remembered as leading the most productive workforce. I want to be remembered for being, leading the most efficient organization. Those aren't the words that come. Usually, as you reflect on this question, they tend to be actually much more human centric and focused. And the question is, how do we get to that human powered leadership that I think the world and the workers desperately need today in order to navigate and become anti-fragile? And the reality is, and this might resonate with you leading an organization today, is unfortunately so many leaders right now are just focused on survival. They're focused on maintaining the status quo, what they know. They're focused on improving efficiency. I love the 10% that tell us they're just simply in reactive mode. They're not even just in survival mode, they're reacting and trying to keep up. Only 26% of leaders today say they're actually focused on working differently, that they're focused on doing something different, rewiring the system in order to meet today's moment and demands. And so the question is, how do we move beyond the fire drill, the blocking and tackling mindset that the majority of leaders are in today to actually, to go back to the words of 1955, capture the hearts and minds of people when we desperately need innovation today? And so, what we argue in Essential, and that's the book that I came out with a couple weeks ago with my co-author, Christy Smith, we take a look back to see, again, what's the business case for this? I think it's one thing to say, we got to be having a human powered leadership. We've been talking about servant leadership for a while. We've been talking about putting people first. What makes this moment different? And how do we begin to make the business case for this today? This, because at the end of the day, this is certainly altruistic, but it's not just altruistic. This is actually good for business and driving the P&L. And if you're a manager today or a leader, this is just the essential way you need to lead in order to navigate those 5 macro headwinds that we discussed in the beginning. And so, as you take a look to think about, well, where is value derived in our economy today? We can go all the way back to the 18th century as you want to start thinking about our modern work history and go through the Industrial Revolution. That is absolutely where efficiency and scalability are important. We then moved into this productivity movement in the 19th century, then followed by quality. Edward Deming and Six Sigma and quality control. The tech organizations and really Project Aristotle through Google really began to highlight, okay, work is no longer independent, it's all being executed through teams. And we saw this team movement occur of like leaders need to be able to capture teams and influence teams at scale. Today, we're arguing we're in the skills economy, that it's all for leaders about developing and acquiring the right skills for their organization. And what I want to spend, the next, 5 to 10 minutes arguing is where we're headed very quickly, if we're not already in this moment, is we're quickly moving to a human and the majority of our leadership models and the majority of the way that we have wired work today is actually still wired for that productivity and industrial resource era, where work was independent, where it was required to be efficient and scalable and productive. Those are often in the antithesis to what's required to bring about human intelligence in our workforce. And so that's the question I want us to think about as we think about what new system must emerge to meet today's demands. How do we make sure that this system is elevating human intelligence, not diminishing it, as the case it is in many organizations today? So I want to level set us. What is human intelligence? I mean, it seems like a term that is common, but I don't think we're talking about it enough in our workplaces. And so as leaders, I want to ground us in a common understanding of what this means. Human intelligence encompasses a wide range of our mental capabilities that empower individuals. Again, that word empowerment is critical to contribute and accumulate knowledge, to address challenges, to be able to be adaptable and agile to meet, various evolving demands, and ultimately engage in imagination and conceptual reasoning. And if you're paying attention, the reason why this is so important is this also needs to be the lane humans play in the age of AI and distributed leadership. As we think about this with artificial intelligence, our current understanding, which of course it's rapidly developing, but even as agentic AI comes onto the forefront, the reality is AI has a lane to play and it should play in its lane. It's really good at being able to identify a pattern. It's all past oriented. It's all learning from past data that's come into the system. And I think my main concern with AI today is it's going to continue to elevate the dominant discourse. It's, as you think about a bell curve in statistics, it's going to continue to point back to answers where the majority are in agreement. And I think this is going to be the real issue for many leaders today is what humans are good at is identifying what's new, what's innovative, what doesn't belong, what hasn't been thought of yet. We are much more spontaneous in our acquisition of knowledge. And how do we make sure that we create cultures, especially in a remote environment where this is difficult, where the human intelligence comes to the forefront and we're designing work to capture this? And then we're making sure that work that fits in something that is pattern identification, that is something that we're okay having the dominant discourse be the accepted answer. That is the type of work we can offload to AI. And so the message here is we need to make sure that we're designing work so that human intelligence stays in its lane and artificial intelligence stays in its lane. And so this requires a radical leadership shift. And, those of you joining might already get this, but for the majority of leaders today, this is a radical shift because it's a mindset move from self interest. We know we've got a lot of self interest. It's actually built into the way that we've designed rational economic theories, the way we've designed performance management. We're going to assume people are going to act in their own interest rather than moving towards a selfless curiosity. The second thing is, as we think about performance management, we really over competition today as a result of this. The third thing, especially as we think about, maintaining equality within our organizations, we have to begin to prioritize long-term optimization over short-term maximization. The CEO of Mars Incorporated famously asked, how much is enough? I know we've been wired and the purpose of business that's been postulated is to maximize shareholder wealth maximization. But what if instead we asked, how much is enough? And how do I optimize my resources across all my stakeholders? And then finally, it requires a that we've taught MBA students, the way that we've taught HR professionals is often that people don't want to work. People are inherently lazy. They're not going to do the right thing on behalf of their organization. And so we've wired a system that really orients itself towards the worst of humankind. But the reality is, what if we were to design work and leadership to bring out the best of our human qualities? In order to do that, we have to trust. We have to have a position of trust that people want to work and will do the right thing in the right environment. And so in closing out, before we, open up for discussion, and again, my goal here was to give a lot of information up front in the context and share with you the research so that we can engage in a rich discussion together for our remaining time. But this is, what Christy and I talk a lot about in the book, and this is the essential leadership flywheel. Because as leaders, we're not going to be able to change the system overnight, but we can change ourselves and our position in which we think, behave, and the cultures that we endorse. So, right off the bat, leadership has to start from a position of suspending self interest. And that's really hard. And we can talk a little bit about in our dialogue today some of the behaviors that get us there. But the reality is, so many leaders today, and it's just the way that power is wired, is we often, we rise to power because of our ability to see others, because of our ability to make decisions that benefit others. And then when we come into a position of power, we become blinded. And it's called the power paradox. So we have to, as leaders, know about this and really begin to create guardrails so that we can operate from a position of suspension of self interest. The second thing is cultivating relentless curiosity. And this is getting so hard, and I see so little of it today in organizations because of the blocking and tackling that's being done. Is how do you actually remain curious about the world, remain curious about the upcoming generation coming in, remain curious about the world that's changing rapidly around us, and really behave from a position of curiosity. The third thing, then, again, this is for business. This is not necessarily a feel good message. We have to maintain a standard of excellence. And leaders who are able to suspend their self interest, to cultivate curiosity, what they can do is lead from a position of excellence and really inspire excellence within their workforce. Majority of people actually want to work for a company that's doing great things. And I think so many of us are really working across organizations that are just really operating out of a position of mediocrity. And so here's the playbook that in essential we go through and really begin to unpack these behaviors of what are those best practices that you have to engage as a leader. These become all the more critical in a distributed work environment. This is harder, not easier, as we become, physical distance separates us, but it doesn't mean that it's not impossible. And if anything, this is the way to lead through distributed remote teams. And so I want to end on this quote, and then let's open it up for conversation here. This is the book Essential. I encourage you, if you haven't had a chance to order it today and read it. More than happy to talk about it offline or within your organization. But we end the book like this. I asked the question, 15, 20 minutes ago, what are those words you want to remember? What's your legacy? And this is our call to action. Let this be the legacy of our time in leadership, that we were the ones who stood up for humanity in the workplace, who recognized that our greatest asset is not in our product or our service, but in how we impact our people. So with that, I would love to open it up. I know this has been a lot of information. And like I said, we'll make sure you have the recording and slides. But what questions do you have? What response do you have? What's top of mind for you as you think about the content and the research that we conducted with Wikistrat a couple years ago?
I'll start by saying that it was super interesting. So we already started receiving some questions in the chat. I'll just say to everyone, please make sure that your questions are very short. Otherwise, it will be more difficult to address them. But we have Monica here presenting a specific case study and asking, given vulnerabilities, how can organizations better safeguard independent contractors?
Monica, I think that is the question we need to be having within our organizations today. Because if we're going, again, I'm at Upwork, so I live and breathe this every day with our freelancers. The reality, especially in the United States with the 1099 contract, is that, there are vulnerabilities that people feel. And the majority of freelancers come in and out through procurement. And so it's a very transactional experience. It's very much driven by compliance and legal requirements and not driven by skills development, by, engaging a freelancer as much as you would a full-time employee. And of course, there's laws and regulations, but I think we've over-rotated at the expense of the humanity of the freelancer that's coming into our organizations. And so, again, this is a choice leaders are making every day of how they treat their contract workforce. That mindset slide, I think, through of what we talked about. I'll just share with you real quick to one piece of research from a qualitative perspective we did. So after looking at the mindset data that came back and seeing that 69% of companies, really were biased towards full-time employee models, even if there was better talent in the freelancer market, I, followed up with qualitative research and asked these 1,400 executives, what's the first word that comes to mind when you think of a freelancer? Those high performing organizations said specialized, innovative, a risk taker, creative, entrepreneurial. The other side, which is unfortunately the majority of organizational leaders today, said transactional, treat, cheap, contractor, gig. And you saw this profound difference in the way that they were viewing talent before they even came into their doors. And so I think there's two things. One, there's a government societal level issue that we need to tackle. If more and more of our fastest growing segment of the workforce is not full-time employees, but 1099, how do we make sure that the right government and societal protections and benefits are in place? So that's number one. And then number two, as leaders, we have the choice and we can decide how we're treating people every day in our organizations. And that is where I think we need better just policies and programs in place to move freelancers out of procurement and into the full talent lifecycle HR model to make sure that they are being treated and given, a lot of the same opportunities while abiding by any sort of local laws. But yeah, that is the question. I think that requires a lot more discipline and research and emphasis today. So thank you for asking.
I'll read out a few questions that were received before the webinar. Then if anyone has any more questions, please share them with us. So one participant asked, how may servant leadership evolve to influence intercultural communication during the era of AI?
Yeah, it's funny when we talk about essential leadership, a lot of times we get asked about servant leadership as well. I studied servant leadership quite a bit. Robert Greenleaf, I think it was 1977, came up with a model. And I think it's good, but I think I worry that it's falling a little short in the age of AI and distributed leadership. And here's why. I think what servant leadership does really well is emphasizes the humanity aspect of this, the empathy, the collaboration, the decision making by consensus. But I think where it fails a little bit is just from a business perspective in terms of being able to keep up with the velocity of decision making, especially as AI continues to accelerate. It's almost in opposition to a lot of the principles of servant leadership and the way you lead. And so I think what we need to do is find that middle ground today. By all means, servant leadership is, I think, a strong North Star to aspire towards. But often we have to acknowledge the realities of which we're facing. And servant leadership is going to be slow and may not move fast enough in order to keep pace with AI. And again, like making sure that we're knowing what is human, what isn't. And so to me, I think, this is why we're leaning a bit into the essential leadership model that yes, you suspend your self-interest where servant leadership starts, but you have to go beyond that. You have to then cultivate curiosity. And at times you're the leader, and that might mean you have to make a decision. You might not be able to always lead with consensus in order to keep up and actually do right by your workforce. And I think this is why, leadership is really ripe for a new model today. What is that new model that takes the best of servant leadership, that takes the best of, essential leadership and puts us back in focus that it's still driving business results where businesses are staying longer in the S&P 500. There's no longer this huge mistrust and angst in the workforce. I think we need a new leadership model, if I'm going to be frank. And I think, again, this is part of the work I'm trying to do and why I wanted to come here to this webinar is continue to connect with experts in community in this place who are looking to solve for this. Just like the question Monica asked, big question. How do we think about getting the 1099 employment right? This is another big question. How do we think about leadership differently in the age of AI? And I think we can take the best of other leadership models.
Another question that we receive from the crowd is, the more experienced of us perceive that the culture with which we learn what is not written in the books is disappearing. Is this feeling of loss justified? Are we not leaving behind any key aspects in the creation of a shared culture?
I love this question because I think whoever asked this, I think that there's a lot of people who would resonate with this. And it's funny, there's a great article that was written both in Bloomberg and in Fortune by Diane Brady, who does the CEO Daily. And she talked about this need for nostalgic that's happening, especially in executive leadership positions, because there is this feeling of loss that's occurring. The way that things have been, the way that things worked in previous times are really being shaken up and broken. And the question is, what are we losing as a result of this? And I think it's the right question to be asking today. I certainly think there's elements of FOMO going on, fear of missing out, whether it's the younger generation or the older generation grieving the loss of the way things have been. But the reality is, I really think, and I think we probably intuitively feel this, I certainly see it in the research, but we are at a crossroads right now where the way things are breaking. We've never seen a more polarized workforce. There's two different, I think ways that people think we should be fixing this. Some is by going back and doubling down on what worked 10, 15 years ago. Others is throwing that playbook out the window and trying something completely different. And I do think what you're probably sensing and seeing is some pendulum swings that are going a little bit too far away from what we know. And so I think as human behavior, we're grappling with what is that middle ground? What is that medium where we retain what needs to still be true in our workforces today, the cultural elements that, we have decades of research, we know work, that we want to preserve. But how do we make sure that we're moving, going back to that chart, beyond just becoming resilient and like becoming preserving what has been to actually be able to break and have something new emerge and innovate. And that's going to get balanced. And I'll tell you what, there is not a one size fits all to this. This is going to depend on wisdom, judgment, ethical leadership within our organizations of at what speed do you break what has worked in order to allow the newness to emerge, and at what pace are you falling behind because you're in preservation mode. And I think this is something that organizations are going to continue to grapple with. And I feel for the leaders who have created a model that worked so well for so long, but really between AI, the pandemic, remote work, we do need a new model to emerge. And again, that's going to require some balance and context of how fast do you do that within your organization. But I will say, I feel pretty strongly about this. I encourage us not to go back. I think there's a lot of going back to how things were. And I don't think that's going to be sustained success for both the organization and the workforce.
Right, so I think we covered all the questions we had so far. So I think you wanted to share a few more insights, right?
Yeah,
Before
I
we
mean, I
move
think
on.
if there's any other questions, I want to make sure I'm not spending too much time talking. But I mean, I would also just love to hear from the community here in the chat. Any friction points, pain points, what else is top of mind as you think about this? Because I mean, again, there is no easy solution here. And so would love just to know from this community too, what's resonating and as the rubber meets the road in real life, which of these forces are maybe the most troubling or that you're struggling with today. So maybe I'll give it a minute before moving on. And I think we just
So
got a new question too. Yeah, go ahead.
earlier, someone said that they're seeing Gen Z expecting quite fairly for leaders to stretch to meet the needs of their team, or at least meet in the middle. This is quite a paradigm shift for some older leaders, even Gen X. And someone else
Absolutely.
commented that corporates do not fully understand Gen Zers being values driven. The communication around values is more often than not greenwash.
Yeah, if I could respond to those two things too. Yeah, I mean, spot on to who said the comment about the paradigm shift, even for Gen X. I mean, listen, I'm an elder millennial. I turned 40 this year, and I have had some like take my breath moments away, managing and leading. a team of younger people myself, and I'd like to think I'm, pretty open-minded, and obviously my whole job is about exploring new ways of working. But it is a big paradigm shift, and I think it's just something we have to recognize. And I think as I reflect a little bit on my own experience, I think what has happened before is I'm just speaking about my own experience as a millennial coming up through the workforce. There was just frustration. It always felt of us coming into the workforce of trying to push boundaries of, basically complaining that, work was broken in some regards. And I felt like we were kind of forced to continue to fit the model. And so my encouragement and what I'm trying to do is again cultivate that curiosity to understand, why is Gen Z thinking about work this way? Why is this their values? What has occurred in their lifetime that they think they view the world differently than I do? And just some quick stats on Gen Z. I mean, they are the most diverse population the world has ever seen. There's more diversity in Gen Z than any other population. They are the truly first digital native generation in workforce that's coming into our workplaces. And that can't, I mean, we're just beginning to understand and learn from neuroscience and the medical field what being a digital native human being is and what that looks like. So, anyways, I just think that comment is spot on, and just encourage us to continue to practice that curiosity, as opposed to angst that I think Gen X and probably millennials felt as they tried to push on some of the norms. And then when it comes to values, I do want to comment on that. And it's something we actually have a chapter in the book, chapter 4 on purpose and values within an organization. And quite frankly, all the washing that has occurred. Again, like we can debate this. Organizations have had to weigh in on societal level issues. And I think what's happened is they haven't necessarily put a stake in the ground. And so they've led and said one thing, but the reality, their insides and the outsides don't match. And that's something we go into depth on in the book, and the really the disadvantage that's creating both as a business to their shareholders, but also to their stakeholders. And I do think in a polarized workplace today, leading from values and really remaining core to those, what are the core humanity values that need to be true? But then being really careful that if your insides don't match your outside, that is not something you should be publicly commenting on or weighing in on. And I think that's going to continue to be an issue as we move forward. And then I think we've got one more new question here in the chat too, if seen that come through right, which is around AI chatbots. What do you recommend for career advice? Yes, this is a great question because, as I said before, we can debate whether or not this is a good thing in the long run. But the reality is, it's here, it's coming, and it's a train that's not going to be stopped. And so, when it comes to career advice, the reasoning models that are, I use ChatGPT quite a bit, but I've switched over to the reasoning models, which provide more conceptual reasoning, provide more context. I think the newer models are going to be much better when it comes to career coaching, just because of the way that they're built by design. And so, I mean, Claude also, I think, is a good model of reasoning as well. So it's less tool specific, I would say, and more of the type of AI model that you're using. And again, for writing, for editing, quick tasks that necessarily don't require contextual reasoning, I think any chatbot will do. But I really recommend the new reasoning models that have just hit within the last several weeks, when it comes to career coaching, because you'll be able to prompt it better. It'll be able to reason with you much better. And again, little less concern about it moving to that dominant discourse answer that's just based on statistical probability, which the original AI chat models were built off of. So hopefully that answers your question. Less of a specific tool and much more of the underlying model that's being used to come up with the answers in coaching.
So let's talk a bit about AI really, and also about remote work. So the time that we had the simulation together, it was about 2 years, I think, after
Yep.
people started recovering from COVID, so started coming back to the office. And now we see a shift that more and more companies are demanding in-office days. So from this new perspective of 2025, when you look at 2030, do you think remote work is here to stay? Will it be more dominant in 5 years, or is this new way of leaders asking people to go back to office reshape or shape back the workforce and the world of work as it was before COVID?
I'm actually, if I had to be honest with you, I am shocked we are still having this conversation, to be honest with you, to your point, 2 years after the simulation, because if I even reflect on the hundreds of pages, right, of documentation we got from the simulation, at that time, this was early 2023, it felt like remote work was more of a table stakes than it does today in some ways, as I reflect on what the experts were thinking. And I find this so ironic because as you think about artificial intelligence and the way in which people are going to start, continuing to work and learn, everyone wants to get back to that water cooler conversation. These executives want to have 5 days RTO. We got to get back to the water cooler. We got to get back to the in-person whiteboard to have innovation. The reality is that knowledge is not captured within your AI system. The smarter intelligence to work today is actually making sure that knowledge capture is occurring within systems that AI can learn from and continue to get smart about your particular context or organization. And so I actually just find this fascinating right now because in an era where we should actually be leaning into remote and distributed work, leaning into knowledge capture that's occurring within our systems for AI to generate output from, we're doing the exact opposite. We're trying to get it offline and important about human to human connection that's done in person. I don't think that's 5 days a week is, I think, quite frankly, a really bad idea in the era of AI. And I think the other thing that's going to occur as talent, I mean, one of the things that, because of time, I didn't really go into as much depth, but the skill shortage in the inbound labor market that's occurring across multiple industries is going to continue to put pressure on leaders when it comes to talent. And if you are just recruiting in your local market, that is a big miss. I mean, that to me is not going to create an anti-fragile organization. That is like the epitome of becoming fragile. And so that's, I am still very bullish on remote work because of AI in particular. And I do think people are going to realize all that knowledge loss that's occurring in person that actually needs to be captured in AI systems. And again, this is all about collective intelligence and collective knowledge today. And that's, again, not going to occur at the whiteboard or water cooler. So I will just share what has worked really well for us at Upwork. We are a remote first company. But we do have mandatory twice a year gatherings where we come together and it's all about community and connection. We actually don't do a lot of business. A lot of the business does not take place there, but it is about building trust, making sure that we can work faster together in an async distributed manner. It's making sure that we have a sense of community and I get to know someone a little bit more than I may in an environment where we're communicating over Zoom or Slack. So I just don't think the 5 day work week RTO is long term. I think it's building fragile systems, and I think time will tell. So maybe we'll have to get back together and do this webinar in 2 to 3 years and see if my prediction holds true. But I'm a big believer in remote work, and companies that are embracing remote work and AI, I think, have a much stronger performance trajectory than those who don't.
Thank you. So we just have 4 more minutes left, which is
Yeah.
too short of a time for
Yep.
this question, but I have to ask it. So from this perspective of now, February 2025, when you look at February 2030, how does AI reshape, doesn't shape the world of work?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I'll answer it in our time remaining. Kind of TLDR. I think we're at again a crossroads. There's two ways that we can use AI today, and I don't think this. I think it should be an and here, not an either or. But it's the decision we make, and so it could be used as an efficiency play where AI is driving efficiency and productivity, or it could be used as creating a more creative, learning, coached workforce. And so, like AI can go in either direction. We can use it to automate, and that's the short term, low hanging fruit play that we're seeing today. Or we can really use it as the way to reimagine the way we're actually thinking about work, the way we're thinking about value capture within our organizations. And again, I go back to that slide with the artificial intelligence and human intelligence and how do we build our organizations so those two are both thriving in harmony with one another. And right now, if I'm going to be frank, I think a lot of those are in opposition. We've taken out too much of human intelligence in the way that we've wired work, and we've over rotated artificial intelligence on just driving productivity and efficiency, not higher order goals that I think AI can help us achieve. And so, I'm 50-50 right now. I think these are decisions and choices leaders are making every day and how they're incorporating and designing AI. And again, I think time will tell. Will we be on the right side of history here? That's a decision leaders are making right now in real time, which is why I'm on the road right now giving presentations like this to hopefully encourage dialogue. This doesn't have to happen to us. We should be in the driver's seat. We need to maintain human agency, which is something we talk a lot about in Essential. And again, the leadership behaviors and models to make sure that humans remain, in control and have full autonomy over the machine and system. So great question.
All right, so we have basically 1 minute left. So if there's anything else that you'd like to share, so I think that kind of
Okay.
wraps it up. But if there's anything else that you'd like to add on top of that, great.
Yeah, I would just encourage for those who are either joining us live or going to listen to the recording, find me on LinkedIn. Definitely would love to continue this dialogue. I think there's more questions than answers right now, if we're going to be honest, and a lot of the dialogue we're having around the future of work. So this is going to only be solved with community. So find me on LinkedIn. And like I said, just one more plug for Essential, the book. If any of this resonated with you today, both live or listening to the recording, go to your local bookstore or you can order on Amazon, wherever you find your books. We really want to get this message out there and are here to help in whatever capacity. And then finally, if you go to upwork.com/research, you'll see all the research. Have an open system of all the research I presented on today. And so you'll find all the source documents and everything that we're seeing on our labor market in real time. So lots of information out there. LinkedIn, Essential, upwork.com/research. Would love just to stay in contact with this community.
Right. Kelly, thank you so much. It was fascinating. And thank you everyone who joined us today. We will meet next month for a third episode on future of work, and we'll keep you posted. Thank you again so much.
Great. Thank you for having me.